7 years. 7 years of brother murdering brother across the burning edge of the galaxy. 7 years since Istvan V, where loyalty died screaming in the volcanic ash. The Horus heresy had transformed the Imperium into a charnel house of its own making, and now the architect of this catastrophe turned his gaze toward the prize he had coveted from the beginning. Terra, the cradle of humanity, the throne of his father. The year was 014 by the reckoning of the 31st millennium. Warmaster Horus Lupercal, once the Emperor's favoured son, now ascendant vessel of chaos, had gathered his forces for the final stroke. 9 traitor legions marched under his banner, their ranks swollen with corrupted Imperial Army regiments, dark mechanicum war engines, and demonic entities that twisted reality with their mere presence. This was not merely an army. This was an apocalypse given form, purpose, and direction. But the path to Terra had not been swift. For all his power, for all the dark blessings bestowed upon him by the ruinous powers, Horus understood that the throne world would not fall to simple force of arms. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, had spent years transforming the Sol system into the most heavily fortified region of space in human history. Every approach vector bristled with weapons platforms. Every planet and moon housed defense installations. The very void itself had been weaponized, seeded with mines and automated kill systems designed to slaughter anything that dared approach uninvited. Terra herself had become a fortress beyond comprehension. The Imperial Palace, that mountain range of adamantium and faith built in the Himalayan highlands, represented the ultimate expression of defensive architecture. Dawn had dismantled portions of the palace to strengthen others, ruthlessly prioritizing function over aesthetics, void shields layered upon void shields, lance batteries capable of striking targets in low orbit, underground bunker networks that could house millions. The Praetorian of Terra had prepared for this moment with the same methodical precision that defined his every action, yet preparation could only achieve so much against the sheer magnitude of forces arrayed against the throne world. Horus commanded legions that had once been humanity's finest warriors, now twisted into something far more terrible. The sons of Horus, his own gene sons, formed the spearhead of the attack. The Death Guard brought their inexorable advance and clouds of toxic miasma. The World Eaters knew only fury and the need to spill blood. The Emperor's children had descended into such depravity that reality itself recoiled from their excesses. The Word-bearers chanted prayers to dark gods while the Thousand Suns wove sorceries that bent space and time. The Iron Warriors, masters of siegecraft, planned the methodical dismantlement of every defense. Even fragments of the Night Lords and Alpha Legion lurked in the shadows, pursuing their own inscrutable objectives. Against this tide, Dawn could marshal only 3 full Space Marine legions. His own Imperial Fists stood as the primary defenders, their expertise in fortification now tested as never before. The Blood Angels, led by the angelic Primarch Sanguinius, represented hope made manifest, their nobility standing in stark contrast to the corruption assailing Terra. The White Scars under Jahatai Khan brought speed and ferocity, hit-and-run tactics that might exploit weaknesses in the traitor siege lines. These 3 legions were supported by elements of the Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal guardians whose martial prowess was matched only by their unwavering loyalty. The Sisters of Silence provided defense against psychic assault. Millions of Imperial Army soldiers manned the walls and bastions, ordinary humans prepared to die for the Imperium. 3 Titan legions stood ready to deploy their god machines. The Mechanicum forces that remained loyal prepared their war engines and blessed their weapons. It was not enough. Everyone knew it was not enough. The disparity in numbers told its own story, but Dawn had not built his defense expecting to win through strength of arms alone. His strategy revolved around a single principle: delay. Buy time. Every hour the defenders held was an hour closer to salvation, for Robert Gilliman raced toward Terra with his Ultramarines Legion, while Lionel Johnson led the Dark Angels through the warp storms that had isolated much of the galaxy. Even the Space Wolves, thought lost after their confrontation with the Alpha Legion, might yet arrive in time. If Dawn could hold until these reinforcements arrived, the siege could be broken, the traitors crushed between hammer and anvil. Horus understood this calculus as well as any. Time was his enemy as much as it was Dawn's ally. Every day he delayed was another day for loyalist forces to converge upon Terra. The War Master could not afford a protracted siege. He needed to break through quickly, decisively, overwhelmingly. This urgency would drive every decision in the campaign to come, pushing the traitors toward ever more desperate tactics, ever darker bargains with their demonic patrons. The Solar War began on the first day of Primus in 014. The Iron Warriors erupted from the warp at the edge of the Sol system, their fleet configured for maximum shock and brutality. Perturabo, their Primarch, had calculated the approach vectors with characteristic precision. Massive transport vessels, up-armoured to the point of absurdity, served as fire ships designed to absorb punishment while clearing paths for the main assault elements. Behind these expendable vanguards came a space hulk designated the Daughter of Woe, its bulk sufficient to shield entire battle groups as they pushed through the initial defensive spheres. Dawn had anticipated such tactics. His defensive architecture consisted of multiple concentric spheres, each designed to attrit the attackers while buying time for the inner defences to prepare. The outermost sphere included automated defence platforms, patrol fleets, and sensor arrays designed to provide early warning. The second sphere, anchored on Pluto, represented a major fortified position with significant fleet elements. The third sphere utilised Mars and its orbital shipyards, though the red planet's loyalty had become questionable as schism tore through the Mechanicum. The fourth sphere centred on Jupiter and Saturn, transforming their moons into fortress positions. The fifth and innermost sphere defended Terra herself, Luna, and the immediate approaches to the throne world. Additionally, Terra possessed something unique in all the galaxy. 2 artificial Mandeville points existed within the Sol system itself, relics of the Dark Age of technology that allowed ships to exit the warp far closer to the system's heart than should have been possible. Dawn had fortified the likely approach vectors from these internal jump points with some of his most powerful defences, calculating that any attacker would need to use them to bypass the outer defensive spheres. The Iron Warriors smashed into the outer defences with characteristic brutality. Their fire ships absorbed lance strikes and missile barrages that would have vaporized lesser vessels, pushing through the kill zone to engage the Loyalist patrol fleets directly. When the fire ships finally succumbed to the accumulated damage, they had already accomplished their purpose, creating corridors through the defensive fire where follow-up elements could advance with reduced casualties. The Daughter of Woe proved as effective as Perturabo had calculated, its massive bulk providing mobile cover for the Iron Warriors' battle groups as they pressed deeper into the system. But the Iron Warriors represented only the first wave. As the Loyalist fleets repositioned to counter this assault, the Sons of Horus and Thousand Suns translated from the warp. Their arrival coordinated to exploit the confusion. Ezekiel Abaddon commanded the Sons of Horus fleet with aggressive competence, pressing attacks wherever the defenders showed weakness. Azek Ahriman led the Thousand Suns in sorcerous assaults that defied conventional void warfare tactics, his vessels appearing and disappearing as warp rifts opened and closed according to his will. 5,000 word-bearers under Zadulayak provided support, their chaplains chanting prayers that resonated through the immaterium. Even elements of the Night Lords participated, their terror tactics designed to break morale among the defenders. The sheer mass of the traitor armada overwhelmed the outer defensive spheres through brutal arithmetic. Dawn's forces inflicted horrific casualties, destroying dozens of traitor vessels for every Loyalist ship lost. But the traitors could afford such losses. They had come prepared to pay any price for victory. The battle for Pluto represented a critical juncture. Dawn had reinforced the dwarf planet's defences extensively, understanding its strategic importance as the anchor of the second defensive sphere. The Lord of the Imperial Fists personally commanded elements of his legion in the defence, supported by units from other Loyalist forces. What followed was a brutal close-quarters engagement, where the Iron Warriors' expertise in assault operations met the Imperial Fist's defensive mastery. The fighting devolved into a savage brawl where thousands died for every metre of fortification. In the midst of this carnage, Rogel Dawn confronted Alpharius, Primarch of the Alpha Legion, whose forces had infiltrated Pluto's defence network. The duel between the two Primarchs became the stuff of legend, though accounts differ on its conclusion. Imperial records claim Dawn slew Alpharius, striking him down with Storm's teeth, his massive chainsword. But Alpharius was Alpharius. The nature of the Alpha Legion meant certainty remained elusive. Had Dawn truly killed a Primarch, or merely a body double? Did it matter? The Alpha Legion presence in the Sol system diminished significantly after this engagement, suggesting that whoever fell on Pluto, their loss mattered. Yet even as the defenders held Pluto, disaster struck elsewhere. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, had been preparing a ritual of staggering complexity and ambition. Working with traitor forces who had infiltrated deeper into the system, he transformed the Shrine of Unity, an orbital comet station, into a massive warp gate. This psychic architecture bypassed entirely the defensive spheres Dawn had so carefully constructed, allowing traitor fleets to translate directly from the warp far closer to Terra than should have been possible. Through this gate poured the fleets of Horus himself, alongside the demonic Primarchs Angron and Fulgrim. The sheer power of these entities warped space around them. Angron's flagship, the Conqueror, reeked of blood and madness. The World Eater's Primarch reduced to little more than a vessel for Khorne's rage. Fulgrim's vessel emanated corruption so profound that reality itself seemed to blister in its wake. The Emperor's children. Primarch having ascended to demonhood through acts that defied description. The Martian traitors, freed from the loyalist blockade that had contained them during the earlier phases of the war, surged forth to join Horus. The Dark Mechanicum brought their own terrible weapons, corrupted titans that walked like living nightmares, war machines that fused metal and flesh in blasphemous configurations, weapons that killed in ways that violated the laws of physics. Kelber Hal, the traitorous fabricator general, commanded this force with the same brilliance that had once made him the master of Mars, now bent entirely toward Terra's destruction. Aboard the Phalanx, Dawn's massive mobile fortress station, the Praetorian confronted the tactical reality that his outer defences had failed. The solar war, which he had hoped would last months, buying crucial time for reinforcements to arrive, had lasted barely a solar month. The traitor fleets now orbited within striking distance of Terra herself. The remaining loyalist fleets, drastically outnumbered, fell back to the edge of the system, seeking positions where they might strike effectively rather than dying in futile direct engagement. Plans had existed for evacuating the Emperor from Terra aboard the Phalanx, retreating to continue the war from a more defensible position. Such suggestions were met with silence from the Emperor himself, who remained sequestered deep within the Imperial Palace, wrestling with forces that even his gene sons could not fully comprehend. The war in the Webway, humanity's secret project to create a network of safe passages through reality, had gone catastrophically wrong. Demonic entities poured through breaches in the Webway, assaulting Terra from within even as enemies gathered without. The Emperor could not abandon the Golden Throne, the psychic amplifier that allowed him to maintain the barriers holding back the demon tide. If he left, the Webway gate would collapse, and demonic legions would erupt directly into the Imperial Palace. Terra would fall not to siege but to apocalyptic breach from within. This meant everything now rested on the fortifications Dawn had built on Terra herself. The Imperial Palace would have to withstand what was coming. There would be no relief, no evacuation, no clever strategic withdrawal. The defenders would hold, or they would die. Perhaps both. On the 13th day of Secundus, the bombardment of Terra began. The traitor fleet, having achieved orbital superiority, unleashed a barrage that beggared description. Thousands of vessels fired simultaneously, their weapons ranging from conventional macro cannons and lance batteries to esoteric warp-based weapons that corrupted as they destroyed. The first shell targeted the Sanctum Imperialis itself, the Emperor's personal quarters, for symbolic rather than tactical reasons. It never reached its target. Point defense systems designed specifically to protect the palace's innermost sectors intercepted the shell, detonating at kilometers above the surface. But that single shell represented only the opening note in a symphony of destruction. For hours, then days, the bombardment continued without pause. Entire sections of Terra's surface were reduced to molten slag. Hive cities that had stood for millennia crumbled under the sustained fire. The atmosphere itself caught fire in places, superheated air creating storms of such intensity they registered as seismic events. Billions died in the opening days of the assault, vaporized or buried under collapsing structures, burned alive or suffocated as the air itself became poison. The Imperial Palace, shielded by void shields of staggering power, weathered the bombardment better than the surrounding areas, but even these shields could not hold indefinitely. Each impact drained their capacitors, Each sustained barrage brought them closer to overload. Dawn had calculated precisely how long the shields would last under various bombardment intensities. His projections suggested the outer void shields would fail within weeks. After that, the bombardment would begin chewing through the palace's physical structure, layer by adamantium layer, until nothing remained but ruins. Horus did not intend to wait that long. The bombardment served multiple purposes beyond simple destruction. It kept the defenders pinned, unable to sortie or counterattack effectively. It demonstrated the futility of resistance, breaking morale among the defenders and civilian population. Most importantly, it softened the defences in preparation for ground assault. The War Master understood that bombardment alone could not win this siege. Eventually his forces would need to take the palace the hard way, by putting boots on the ground and fighting through every fortification, every corridor, every room. The pattern established itself quickly. Orbital bombardment, waves of drop pods and assault craft, limited ground assaults to probe defences and capture key positions, aerial attacks by corrupted aircraft and demon engines, then more bombardment, restarting the cycle. This methodology reflected sound siege doctrine, systematically degrading the defenders' capabilities while establishing footholds for larger assaults. The defenders fought back with everything they possessed. Defense lasers tracked incoming craft, their targeting spirits working overtime to identify and engage priority targets. Fighter craft launched from hidden hangars, engaging traitor aircraft in dogfights that painted contrails across Terra's burning skies. The palace's own armaments, weapons capable of engaging orbital targets, fired at traitor vessels whenever they dropped low enough to be vulnerable. But fundamentally, the defenders could only react. Initiative belonged entirely to the attackers. Horus chose where and when to strike. Dawn could only respond, rushing forces to threatened sectors, reinforcing positions under pressure, attempting to predict where the next blow would fall. This tactical dynamic favoured the attacker in ways that compounded over time. Every response weakened some other position. Every reinforcement left some other sector vulnerable. The defenders were being stretched thin, pulled in too many directions, forced to defend everything while the attackers could concentrate on specific objectives. Weeks passed in this hellish pattern. The outer defences slowly crumbled under the relentless pressure. Defence positions fell silent one by one as their crews were killed or their ammunition ran out. Void shield generators overloaded in cascading failures, each collapse widening the holes in Terra's protective coverage. The palace still stood, magnificent and defiant, but its survival seemed increasingly a matter of when rather than if. Then the Death Guard arrived. Mortarion, the Pale King, had been delayed by events in the outer reaches of the system, his fleet conducting operations designed to ensure no relief force could reach Terra from the galactic north. Now he brought his legion to the siege, and with them came something far worse than simple military force. The Death Guard had embraced Nurgle, the chaos god of disease and decay. Where they walked, reality itself sickened. Their vessels leaked corruption into the void. Their presence in orbit began warping Terra's climate, creating zones of supernatural pestilence that spread like cancer across the planet's surface. Horus had promised Mortarion the honour of leading the first true Astartes assault on Terra. The Death Guard would be the first legion to set foot upon the throne world in force. This decision reflected tactical calculation as much as politics. The Death Guard excelled at grinding attritional warfare. They advanced inexorably, uncaring of casualties, weathering defensive fire that would break other forces. Perfect for the initial breakthrough attempts, but this decision enraged Angron. The World Eater's Primarch, now fully consumed by his transformation into a demon prince of Khorne, demanded the right to assault the palace immediately. His nature would not permit patience. Every moment spent waiting was agony. The butcher's nails embedded in his brain, driving him to seek combat with increasing desperation. When Horus denied his request, explaining that the Emperor's psychic barrier around Terra would likely destroy a demon prince who approached too close before that barrier had been sufficiently weakened, Angron's fury reached such heights that he began attacking his own forces. To prevent the World Eater's Primarch from destroying his own flagship, the World Eater's Captain Khan took desperate action. He activated a teleport homer that transported Angron to the Night Lord's flagship Nightfall, specifically into a shifting maze that Perturabo had originally constructed to contain the Primarch Vulcan. Within this labyrinth of impossible geometry and deadly traps, Angron would be contained until the traitor assault weakened the Emperor's defences sufficiently for demon princes to manifest on Terra's surface. On the 7th day of Quartus, the Death Guard made planetfall. 9 massive Arc Mechanicus vessels, each commanded by one of Kelbohal's 9 disciples, descended through Terra's atmosphere to beach themselves around the Imperial Palace like grotesque metal islands. These ships would serve as forward operating bases for the traitor ground forces, their holds disgorging endless streams of infantry and war machines. Simultaneously, Death Guard drop pods rained down across the plateau surrounding the palace, thousands upon thousands of them, enough to darken the sky. The defenders met this assault with everything they had remaining. Lance strikes from the palace defences turned hundreds of drop pods into funeral pyres before they reached the ground. Defence turrets tracked the descending craft, firing in coordinated patterns designed to maximise casualties. Where the Death Guard landed, they met prepared positions manned by Imperial Army soldiers, Imperial Fists Space Marines, and elements of the Custodes. The fighting was immediate, brutal and without quarter, but the Death Guard were perhaps the hardest legion to stop through simple application of firepower. They advanced through storms of fire that would have annihilated other forces, their enhanced physiology and Nurgle's blessings allowing them to survive wounds that should have been instantly fatal. Toxic clouds preceded their advance, forcing defenders to fight in sealed suits or rebreathers. Plague weapons turned the battlefield into a charnel house, where the distinction between living and dead became academic. The siege had truly begun. The outer plateau surrounding the Imperial Palace became a hellscape, where armies clashed in battles that would have decided the fate of entire systems in any other war. Here, they were merely preliminary engagements, skirmishes to establish the siege lines that would eventually tighten around the palace itself like a noose. Rogel Dawn stood upon the battlements, his enhanced vision allowing him to witness the scope of forces arrayed against him. His expression revealed nothing. His duty was clear. Hold. Buy time. Trust that reinforcements would arrive before the walls fell. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists would do his duty, regardless of cost. Across the void, aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus gazed down at Terra through viewing ports that had become windows into madness itself. The Warmaster's flagship had transformed over the course of the heresy, warped by chaos into something that existed as much in the warp as in real space. Horus himself had changed even more dramatically. The charismatic general who had united the Great Crusade was gone, consumed by the entity he had become. Power radiated from him in waves that drove lesser beings to their knees. His psychic presence pressed against the barriers around Terra like a tsunami against a seawall, seeking any crack, any weakness that might allow his will to flood through. The Warmaster calculated his position with the portion of his consciousness that remained capable of such mortal concerns. Time worked against him more with each passing day. The assault was proceeding according to plan, perhaps even slightly ahead of projections. But Guilliman approached from the galactic east, his Ultramarines Legion intact and battle-ready. The Lion drove toward Terra from another vector, the Dark Angels representing another full-strength Legion. Even the Space Wolves, bloodied but unbroken, worked their way through the warp storm separating them from the throne world. When these reinforcements arrived, the numerical advantage would shift dramatically against the traitors. Horus would find himself trapped between the palace defences and the relief forces, caught in a vice that would crush his army no matter how favoured by the dark gods. This knowledge drove every decision, pushed every timetable forward, demanded ever greater risks and sacrifices. The siege must conclude before those reinforcements arrived. The Emperor must fall before his scattered legions could gather for one final confrontation. Below, on Terra's tortured surface, the Death Guard pressed their assault with mechanical inevitability. They established siege camps in the ruins of hab blocks and industrial sectors, transforming the wreckage into fortified positions from which they could coordinate their attacks. The camps themselves became centres of corruption, zones where reality thinned and sickened. Mortal soldiers conscripted from conquered worlds laboured to build siege works under the supervision of Death Guard overseers. Dark Mechanicum adepts assembled war engines from components delivered via dropship. Wordbearers' chaplains led prayer groups that invoked powers best left unnamed. The defenders conducted raids against these camps when opportunities presented themselves. Small forces, usually led by officers who understood they were being sent to probable death, would sortie from the palace to strike at vulnerable targets. These attacks rarely achieved strategic objectives, but they inflicted casualties and, more importantly, kept the traitors off balance. A successful raid might destroy ammunition stockpiles or disable siege equipment, buying the defenders precious additional hours or days. But these raids could not prevent the inexorable build-up of traitor forces. More ships arrived in orbit daily, disgorging fresh troops and equipment. The plateau surrounding the palace filled with enemy forces until the land itself seemed to writhe with malevolent intent. The White Scars conducted their own raids on a larger scale, using their mobility to strike deep into traitor positions before withdrawing. Jagatai Khan led several of these attacks personally, his Jin sons following their father into battles where victory meant survival and defeat meant annihilation. One such raid penetrated deep into the Death Guard siege lines, the White Scars moving so quickly that the slower traitor forces could not react effectively. The Khan's target was ambitious, the command structure coordinating the Death Guard assault. If he could kill or disrupt the traitor leadership, it might buy the defenders weeks of confusion as the enemy reorganized. The White Scars swept through traitor positions like a blade through flesh, killing with surgical precision before enemy reinforcements could respond. But Mortarion had anticipated such tactics. The Death Guard Primarch personally led the counterattack, his demonic form warping reality around him. The battle that followed became legend among the few who survived to tell of it. Jagatai Khan and Mortarion, brothers who had once fought side by side during the Great Crusade, now tried to kill each other with every weapon at their disposal. The Khan's speed and skill met Mortarion's inexorable power and supernatural resilience. The duel ranged across the battlefield as both Primarchs sought advantage. Mortarion wielded Silence, his massive scythe, with preternatural skill despite its size. Each swing opened wounds that festered immediately, Nurgle's blessings ensuring that even shallow cuts became agonizing infections. The Khan countered with the White Tiger Dao, moving with such speed that his movements blurred even to transhuman eyes. He carved wounds across Mortarion's corrupted flesh, but the Death Guard Primarch barely seemed to notice, regenerating damage almost as quickly as it was inflicted. The battle might have lasted hours had not the Khan employed a tactic that surprised even his corrupted brother. As Mortarion prepared what should have been a killing blow, Jagatai deliberately opened his defense, allowing the Death Guard Primarch to land a strike that pierced through the Khan's armor and deep into his chest. But this apparent sacrifice created the opening the Khan needed. As Mortarion's scythe impaled him, Jagatai drove the White Tiger Dao through his brother's neck, the blade enhanced with psychic energy that even a demon prince could not ignore. Mortarion's head fell from his shoulders, his demonic essence shrieking as it was forced back into the warp. The Death Guard forces reeled from the psychic shockwave of their Primarch's banishment, their coordination collapsing into confusion. The White Scars, despite their own Primarch's grievous wounds, pressed the advantage ruthlessly. The raid that was supposed to be a quick strike transformed into a full-scale rout of the Death Guard positions in that sector, but the victory came at terrible cost. Jagatai Khan lay dying, his enhanced physiology struggling against wounds that would have killed a normal human instantly. His White Scars bore him from the battlefield on a commandeered Leman Russ tank, fighting their way back to the palace through enemy forces that pressed in from all sides. They reached the relative safety of the palace walls with their Primarch still clinging to life, though barely. Medici personnel examined the Khan's wounds and pronounced them fatal. Mortarion's scythe had inflicted damage that even Astarte's physiology could not overcome. Nurgle's corruption spread through the Khan's system despite every effort to purge it. In desperation, the Khan was brought before Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor and one of the few beings in existence who might possess the power to save a dying Primarch. Malkador examined Jagatai's wounds with psychic senses that perceived more than physical damage. The corruption went deep, threading through the Khan's essence at a level that transcended mere biology. Healing such damage would require power that Malkador was not certain he possessed. Yet even as one crisis unfolded, others emerged across the siege lines. With Mortarion temporarily banished and the Death Guard in disarray, the traitors needed to maintain pressure on the defenders. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, had been preparing his own assault on the palace. The Thousand Sons specialized in psychic warfare, and Magnus himself ranked among the most powerful psychers to ever exist, exceeded only by the Emperor himself. His target was not the physical walls, but the metaphysical barriers that protected Terra from demonic incursion. Working with word-bearers who had spent years studying the dark arts of chaos worship, Magnus began a ritual of staggering ambition. The plan required the traitors to create a specific geometric pattern around the palace, a star of chaos whose lines would intersect precisely where the Emperor sat within the Sanctum Imperialis. Each point of the star needed to be consecrated with massive bloodshed, enough death to thin the barrier between real space and the warp. If they succeeded, the Emperor's psychic barrier would weaken sufficiently for demon princes to manifest on Terra's surface. The Neverborn, the demonic entities that serve the Chaos gods, would be able to walk upon Terra without fear of immediate banishment. This represented perhaps the greatest threat the Defenders faced. The Imperium's armies could fight mortal enemies, no matter how corrupted or enhanced. They had weapons and tactics developed over millennia to combat Astartes, even traitor Astartes. But demon princes were another matter entirely. Angron, Mortarion and Fulgrim in their ascended forms could devastate entire armies. Their presence alone corrupted reality, driving mortals to madness and despair. If such entities could manifest freely upon Terra, the defense would collapse not through military defeat but through supernatural terror. Magnus began his work while Horus coordinated the physical assaults that would provide the necessary bloodshed. The Warmaster understood that the siege had reached a critical juncture. The defenders had proven more resilient than projected. Casualties among the traitor forces exceeded estimates. Time continued to work against him. He needed to break through decisively and soon. The ritual Magnus proposed offered that breakthrough, but it required specific conditions that could only be created through coordinated military action. The assault intensified across multiple sectors simultaneously. Iron warriors under various commanders pressed attacks against key defensive positions, their expertise in siege warfare employed to identify and exploit weaknesses in the palace defences. World Eaters, even without their Demon Prince Primarch, launched frenzied assaults that cared nothing for casualties, their only objective to kill and die in sufficient numbers to consecrate ground for Magnus's ritual. Sons of Horus forces, the most disciplined of the traitor legions, struck at crucial junctions and command points, attempting to disrupt loyalist coordination. The plateau before the palace walls became an abattoir beyond description. Millions died in battles that lasted days without pause, combatants fighting until they collapsed from exhaustion or blood loss. Artillery exchanges turned entire sectors into moonscapes of overlapping craters. Titan battles shook the earth with each step of the god machines, their weapons capable of levelling city blocks with single shots. The air itself became toxic, a mixture of chemical weapons, burning promethium, and the corrupted exhalations of demon engines. Through this hell moved the common soldiers of both sides, human beings caught in a war between gods. Imperial army troopers manned defensive positions until enemy fire reduced their fortifications to rubble, then fell back to secondary positions to repeat the process. They died by the thousands every hour, their bodies adding to the countless corpses that choked streets and filled trenches. Many went mad from the sustained horror, their minds breaking under the pressure of constant combat against enemies that should not exist. Yet others found reserves of courage they had not known they possessed, standing firm even as reality itself seemed to dissolve around them. The Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, deployed in limited numbers to shore up critical positions. Each custodian represented the pinnacle of human enhancement, warriors whose capabilities exceeded even Astartes standards. They fought with weapons crafted by the finest artificers, their guardian spears capable of cutting through ceramite armour as easily as flesh. Where they appeared, the traitor advance stalled, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, depending on the strength of forces arrayed against them. But even custodians could be overwhelmed by sufficient numbers, and there were far too few of them to defend all the positions that needed defending. Similarly, the Sisters of Silence deployed their unique capabilities against the psychic threats that increasingly dominated the battlefield. These women, genetic nulls with the power to suppress psychic abilities, served as humanity's answer to the supernatural. Where they fought, sorcerers found their powers failing, demons lost cohesion, and reality reasserted itself. But they too were limited in number. Above all this carnage, the Void War continued. The traitor fleet maintained orbital bombardment, though with decreasing effectiveness as defense systems fell. Loyalist vessels conducted raids when opportunities presented, striking vulnerable targets before withdrawing. These attacks forced the traitors to divert resources to fleet defense. The defenders fought with the desperation of those who understood no retreat was possible. If Terra fell, the Imperium fell. If the Emperor died, humanity would be leaderless against a galaxy that sought its extinction. Every soldier understood the stakes with crystalline clarity. They fought not merely for victory, but for the survival of their species. This knowledge extracted sacrifices that would have been unthinkable in any other war. Deep within the Imperial Palace, the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, fighting a war none of his gene-sons could fully perceive. Across the churning battlefields, another Primarch faced his own crisis of command. Rogel Dawn stood in the Bab Bastion, his command centre overlooking vast swathes of the Imperial Palace defences. Before him spread tactical displays showing force dispositions, casualty estimates, ammunition reserves, all the cold mathematics of siege warfare. The numbers told an inexorable story. The traitors were winning, not through superior tactics or greater courage, but through the simple application of overwhelming force across multiple sectors simultaneously. The defenders fought magnificently, but magnificence could not overcome arithmetic when the ratio of attackers to defenders continued to worsen with each passing day. The Lion's Gate spaceport became the focus of the traitors' next major offensive. This facility represented the largest and most defensible of the palace's two primary spaceports, its structure reaching kilometers into the sky, its internal chambers vast enough to house entire armies. Dawn had garrisoned it with over 18,000 Imperial Fists Space Marines and 800,000 Imperial Army troops under the command of Lord Seneschal Fafnir Ran. It was, by any reasonable estimate, an impregnable fortress that should have taken months to reduce through siege. Perturabo, commanding the assault on behalf of Horus, understood impregnable fortresses better than perhaps any being alive. He studied Dawn's defences with the same methodical precision his brother employed when creating them. The Iron Warriors, Primarch identified weak points invisible to less specialised observers, calculated exactly where to apply pressure and where to feint, orchestrated a campaign that would have been studied at military academies had any survived to do such studying. The assault began with a coordinated strike by nearly all the traitor legions. Death Guard, Iron Warriors, Thousand Sons, Emperor's Children, and Sons of Horus committed forces simultaneously, preventing the defenders from concentrating their strength against any single axis of attack. The World Eaters and corrupted Imperial Army units ran wild through the outer districts of the palace, the Sprawl Magnificon, tying down reinforcements that might otherwise have been deployed to critical positions. This was warfare as complex orchestration, each element designed to complement and enable the others. The anterior Barbican, a series of 6 fortresses protecting the approach to the Lion's Gate, became a charnel house. Here the defenders made the traitors pay for every metre in blood and corpses. Imperial fists held the walls with the same stubborn determination that defined their legion, refusing to yield even when positions became untenable. The Iron Warriors matched them with equal stubbornness, both sides locked in a siege mentality that precluded retreat or mercy. But stubbornness alone could not prevent the inevitable. The traitors brought Titan legions to bear, god machines whose weapons could reduce fortress walls to rubble. Dark Mechanicum war engines added their firepower to the assault, grotesque fusion of machine and demon that violated every principle of sacred technology. Sorcery twisted reality around key defensive positions, weakening void shields and causing structural failures that no amount of adamantium could prevent. After days of sustained assault, the Lion's Gate spaceport fell. The traitors poured through its breached walls in an unstoppable tide, overwhelming the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Lord Seneschal Fafnir Ran fought a brilliant fighting withdrawal, extracting as many of his troops as possible before the position became completely untenable. Those who remained behind sold their lives dearly, but seldom they did. The Imperial Fists who died holding the Lion's Gate did so knowing their sacrifice bought time, though for what purpose they could no longer say. The spaceport's capture changed the strategic situation dramatically. Now the traitors could land reinforcements directly inside the palace's outer defensive perimeter. Titan legions descended from orbit to stomp through streets that had never been designed for such massive war engines. Armoured columns rolled through landing bays designed for peacetime logistics. The outer palace, the sprawling urban complex surrounding the inner fortifications fell rapidly as traitor forces established firm footholds and expanded outward from their landing zones. Dawn watched this unfold with the same expressionless determination that characterized all his actions. He had known the spaceport would fall eventually. The question had been when, and whether its fall could be used to strategic advantage. Now he faced a more difficult calculation. With the Lion's Gate in enemy hands, 4 critical locations stood threatened simultaneously: the Colossi Gate, the Gorgon Bar, the Saturnine Gate, and the Eternity Wall spaceport. The Praetorian of Terra possessed insufficient forces to defend all 4 positions adequately. Simple mathematics dictated that one would fall. The question became which sacrifice would least damage the overall defensive posture. Dawn called his war council, assembling Constantin Valdor and the still recovering Malcador to present his assessment. The Captain General of the Custodes listened with growing dismay as Dawn explained his plan. One position would be abandoned. Its defenders would be left to die, buying time with their lives while the other 3 locations received sufficient reinforcement to hold. Dawn chose the Eternity Wall spaceport. With the traitors controlling orbital space, the defenders had no use for spaceport facilities. The position held symbolic rather than strategic value. Its loss would hurt morale but not materially weaken the defences. Most importantly, Dawn suspected that both Perturabo and Abaddon had identified a weakness in the Saturnine Gate, a subterranean fault line opened by the intense orbital bombardment. If they believed the defenders thought all positions equally vital, they might commit overwhelming force to exploit this weakness. But if Dawn could anticipate their assault and prepare an ambush, the resulting trap might destroy enough traitor forces to buy weeks or even months of additional time. Valdor objected strenuously. The Eternity Wall defenders would be abandoned to certain death, left to fight knowing no reinforcements would come. Dawn acknowledged this with his characteristic bluntness. War demanded sacrifice. Some had to die so others might live. The Praetorian would make the hard choices because someone had to, and he would bear the weight of those decisions without complaint or excuse. The 4 battles erupted near simultaneously, a coordinated traitor push across multiple fronts. At Gorgon Bar, Sanguinius led the Blood Angels and Imperial Fists against a massive Iron Warriors assault. The Angels' presence inspired the defenders beyond normal human endurance. When a Ligia Vulpa warlord Titan threatened to breach the walls, Sanguinius personally assaulted the war machine, landing upon its head and driving the Spear of Telesto through armor plating thick enough to withstand Titan-grade weapons. The God Machine's reactor exploded, sending its wreckage tumbling back into the traitor siege lines. 3 accompanying Warhound Titans fled at the sight of this feat, their crews overcome by the realization they faced an enemy beyond their capacity to engage. Gorgon Bar held, its walls stained with the blood of thousands but still standing. At the Colossi Gate, Yagatai Khan led the defense alongside Constantin Valdor and Blood Angels, First Captain Ralderon. The Great Khan refused to fight a purely defensive battle, organizing a 300-strong jet bike charge that swept from the gate deep into Death Guard positions. The White Scars moved with such speed that the traitor forces could not coordinate effective resistance, the Khan's forces decimating supply lines and command posts before withdrawing back to their own fortifications. But Magnus the Red responded with sorcery, his psychic assault sapping the defenders' will to fight and summoning demon hordes that materialized directly inside defensive positions. Only the combined efforts of the Primarch, the Captain General, and the First Captain prevented the position from being overrun. At the Eternity Wall spaceport, the defenders knew they had been abandoned. Captain Kamba Diaz of the Imperial Fists, Captain Sheban Khan of the White Scars, High Primary Solar General Saul Neboran, and Sisters of Silence. Commander Janisha Kroll understood that Dawn had made his choice. No reinforcements would come, no relief would arrive. They would hold until they died, and then the position would fall. The commanders made the decision to remain with their troops rather than evacuate to fight another day. If these men and women were to die abandoned, they would die led by officers who chose to share their fate. The assault came with World Eaters in the vanguard. Khorne's favoured legion throwing themselves against the spaceport's defences with suicidal fury. Kamba Diaz died on the Ponsola Bridge, refusing to retreat even one step as berserkers charged his position in endless waves. He killed scores before the sheer weight of numbers overwhelmed him. Naboran and his Imperial Army troopers manned the spaceport's gun batteries, turning massive weapons designed for shooting down landing craft against ground targets. When Angron himself arrived, the demon Primarch demanding surrender, Naboran's response was to blast the traitor with every weapon under his command. Angron regenerated from wounds that would have killed any mortal being, his body knitting itself back together through sheer demonic power. The World Eaters took the spaceport floor by floor, room by room, killing everyone they found. Kroll and her Sisters of Silence fought to the last, their null fields providing brief respite from the psychic madness that accompanied the Demon Prince. When the final defenders fell, the World Eaters raised their howls of victory over a position that had cost them thousands of casualties to capture. Angron cared nothing for the tactical implications. He had killed. That was enough. But at the Saturnine Gate, Dawn's gambit paid devastating dividends. The Praetorian had anticipated correctly. Abaddon led an elite Sons of Horus strike force through subterranean tunnels, using termite assault drills and massive mantolith tunneling machines to exploit the fault line weakness. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Breach the gate from below while Fulgrim and the Emperor's children assaulted from above, catching the defenders between two unstoppable forces. Dawn had prepared for exactly this scenario. He dispatched kill teams into the tunnels before the Sons of Horus arrived. Garviel Loken, the legendary Lunar Wolf who had turned against Horus at Istvan, led one such team. Nathaniel Garrow, former Death Guard captain and one of the first to bring word of the heresy to Terra, commanded another. Maximus Thane of the Imperial Fists coordinated the overall defence. Endrid Har and his Black Shield warband, Space Marines who had renounced their legion's colours to fight as irregular warriors, hunted through the darkness seeking enemy infiltrators. The tunnel fighting became savage beyond description. In close quarters with limited manoeuvrability, battles devolved into brutal melees where strength and determination mattered more than tactics. Loken confronted members of his former Mournival, brothers he had once trusted, now corrupted beyond recognition. The combat was as much psychological as physical, each blow carrying the weight of betrayed brotherhood. The Sons of Horus had expected an easy breakthrough. Instead, they found prepared defenders who knew every tunnel, every choke point, every place where a small force might hold against a larger one. Above ground, Fulgrim led the Emperor's children against the Saturnine walls. The Demon Primarch had transformed into something barely recognizable as the noble warrior he had once been. His appearance shifted constantly, reality itself uncertain around his corrupted form. He moved with impossible speed, his blade work transcending mere martial skill to become something approaching art. The defenders died in droves before his advance, unable to match a combatant who fought according to rules that no longer applied to baseline reality. Then Rogel Dawn himself stepped forth to meet his brother. The two Primarchs had once been close, united by their appreciation for perfection in their respective domains. Dawn sought perfection in architecture and fortification, Fulgrim in art and combat. That brotherhood meant nothing now. Fulgrim came as destroyer. Dawn stood as defender. Between them lay only violence. The duel that followed would be retold for millennia. Dawn fought with methodical precision, his sword work efficient rather than elegant, each strike calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum wasted motion. Fulgrim danced around him, his movements flowing like water, his attacks coming from impossible angles. The Demon Primarch's taunts washed over Dawn without effect. The Praetorian had long ago mastered the ability to ignore anything that did not serve practical purpose. Words could not hurt him. Only failure could wound Rogel Dawn. Fulgrim's regenerative abilities allowed him to weather wounds that should have been crippling. Dawn opened his brother's throat with a precise thrust, only to watch the injury close within seconds. But Dawn had not expected to kill Fulgrim through martial prowess alone. He fought to buy time, to keep the Demon Primarch engaged while the tunnel infiltration failed and the trap closed around the traitor forces. When it became clear that Abaddon's underground assault had been decisively defeated, Dawn informed Fulgrim with characteristic bluntness that his attack had failed. The Demon Primarch's rage was magnificent to behold. Rather than press the attack further, Fulgrim withdrew, summoning his elite guard to assassinate Dawn as he retreated. Sigismund, first captain of the Imperial Fists, intervened alongside other Imperial Fists champions. The resulting melee allowed Dawn to survive, though wounded. More importantly, the Saturnine Gate held. The Emperor's children withdrew, their assault broken. The sons of Horus' forces trapped in the tunnels were systematically hunted down and killed. The traitors had achieved one significant victory and suffered one devastating defeat. The Eternity Wall spaceport gave them a second landing facility, but the failure at Saturnine had cost elite forces that could not easily be replaced. Dawn had traded one position, and its defenders for a reprieve measured in weeks. The arithmetic of siege warfare continued its inexorable progression toward the defenders' exhaustion. Yet there were developments beyond the immediate tactical situation. Sanguinius experienced visions during the fighting, his prophetic gift showing him glimpses of events occurring light years away. He saw through Angron's eyes, witnessing the World Eater's Primarch's perspective on the siege. More importantly, he sensed the destruction of New Syria, Angron's homeworld, obliterated by orbital bombardment. This could mean only one thing. Robert Gilliman and Lion L. Johnson were approaching Terra, their legions intact and ready for battle. The relief that Dawn had bought time for was finally drawing near. Admiral Nyorasu Kassen, commanding the remnants of the Loyalist fleet from the system's edge, detected new warp signatures at the boundary of the Sol system. She hailed the approaching vessels, demanding identification. The response came from Corswin of the Dark Angels. The First Legion had arrived, the Lion was coming, reinforcements were finally at hand. But Horus also understood what this meant. His timetable had collapsed. The siege needed to conclude immediately, before the Dark Angels, Ultramarines, and potentially the Space Wolves converged on Terra. The War Master could not afford to fight on two fronts, could not allow himself to be caught between the palace defences and the incoming relief force. He needed to break through now, this moment, regardless of cost. The traitor assault intensified to levels previously unimaginable. With both spaceports under their control, the attackers landed every available reserve. Titan legions walked through streets that crumbled under their weight. Infantry assaults came in waves that never stopped, fresh troops constantly replacing those who fell. The bombardment from orbit reached new heights of intensity, void ships in low orbit, firing at point-blank range despite the risk from ground-based defences. The Emperor's psychic barrier, the invisible shield that had prevented demon primarchs from manifesting too close to the Sanctum Imperialis, began to fail. Magnus and Horus launched coordinated psychic assaults against the Master of Mankind, hammering at his defences with sorceries drawn from the deepest wells of the warp. The Emperor fought back, but his attention remained divided between the siege, the breach in the webway, and now the direct psychic attacks. The barrier contracted, shrinking from covering most of Terra to protecting only the immediate vicinity of the Imperial Palace. This allowed the demon primarchs to manifest fully upon Terra's surface for the first time. Angron descended like a meteor, his arrival announced by the screams of those who died in his immediate vicinity. Mortarion advanced with his death guard, transforming everything around him into a diseased wasteland. The very air rotted where Mortarion walked. Reality sickened. The Eternity Gate, the final barrier protecting the Inner Palace and the Sanctum Imperialis beyond, became the focus of all traitor efforts. Sanguinius took personal command of the Eternity Gate's defence. The Blood Angel's Primarch understood with prophetic certainty that this would be his last battle. He had seen his death in visions since before the heresy began. Horus would kill him aboard the Vengeful Spirit. That future seemed immutable, but Sanguinius had also seen other futures, possibilities that might yet be realized if he fought hard enough, if he sacrificed enough. Perhaps he could wound Horus sufficiently that the Emperor might have a chance. Perhaps his death would serve purpose beyond simple tragedy. The Blood Angels who stood with their Primarch at the Eternity Gate knew they faced certain death. Sanguinius offered them the opportunity to leave. None accepted. If their father would die here, they would die with him. The defence of the Eternity Gate became the stuff of legend even as it unfolded. Sanguinius stood upon the walls, his golden armour gleaming in the fires of war, his wings spread wide so all could see. His presence alone was worth armies. Where he fought, the defenders found strength they did not know they possessed. The traitors threw everything against the gate. Demon engines vomited corruption. World Eaters charged in endless waves. Cornate Titans unleashed weapons that violated the laws of physics. And through it all came Kabanda, greater demon of Khorne, Sanguinius's nemesis from their previous encounters. The Bloodthirster had been given a mission by his dark god. kill 500 Blood Angels in the presence of their Primarch. Ka'Bandha went about his task with methodical enthusiasm, carving through defenders with his massive axe and burning whip. Sanguinius could not allow this slaughter to continue. He dove from the walls to engage the demon directly. The two beings, angel and demon, clashed in an airborne battle that drew the attention of both armies. They had fought before at Cygnus Prime, where Ka'Bandha had broken Sanguinius's legs and sent the Blood Angels into a psychic frenzy that unleashed the Red Thirst. Then Sanguinius had defeated the demon in their second encounter, banishing it back to the warp. Now they met for what would be their final confrontation. Ka'Bandha fought with the raw brutality that defined Khorne's servants. His axe swept in arcs capable of cleaving through ceramite armor. His whip cracked with sounds like thunder, each strike carrying demonic energies that ignored physical protection. Sanguinius matched him with speed and skill, the blade in carmine and spear of Telesto moving in patterns too fast for mortal eyes to follow. The two combatants spiraled through the air above the Eternity Gate, their battle a spectacle of violence and grace. The demon managed to cast Sanguinius to the ground, the angel impacting the walkway with force sufficient to crack the stone. Despair swept through the loyalist forces as their champion fell. But Sanguinius rose, battered, wounded, pushed beyond the limits of endurance by days of constant fighting, he nevertheless rose. Golden light blazed from his halo as he grabbed Ka'Bandha's cloven hoof with one hand and the demon's taloned hand with the other. With a surge of strength that drew upon reserves he did not know remained, Sanguinius brought the greater demon's back down upon his knee. The snap echoed across the battlefield. Ka'Bandha's spine shattered. The Bloodthirster, one of Khorne's mightiest servants, lay broken across the Primarch's knee. Sanguinius spun in the air, building momentum, then hurled the demon's form into the traitor army. Lesser demons, sensing weakness, fell upon Ka'Bandha's broken body and consumed it, banishing the greater demon back to the warp where it would remain trapped for millennia. But there was no respite. Even as Ka'Bandha fell, Angron arrived. The World Eater's Primarch, now fully ascended to demonhood, descended from the sky seeking his brother. The two Primarchs had been friends once, before the Nails, before the bitterness, before the fall to chaos. Now Angron was little more than rage given form, a vessel for Khorne's fury. He roared challenge at Sanguinius, demanding single combat. The angel was already wounded from his battle with Ka'Bandha. He had been fighting for days without pause, his strength depleted, his body accumulating injuries that even Primarch physiology struggled to heal. Angron came fresh to the battle, his demonic form overflowing with power drawn from the warp. The fight seemed hopeless, yet Sanguinius accepted the challenge. He could not allow Angron to rampage through the defenders unchecked. The duel between the two Primarchs defied mortal comprehension. Angron moved with speed that rendered him nearly invisible, his twin axes, Gorefather and Gorechild, reaping a harvest of death with every swing. Sanguinius countered with technique perfected over centuries, his weapons finding openings in Angron's assault that should not have existed. The battle ranged across the walls and into the air, both Primarchs capable of flight through different means. Sanguinius fought with desperate brilliance, knowing this might be his last battle. He inflicted wounds that would have killed any mortal being, opening Angron's flesh with thrust after thrust of his spear. But the demon Primarch regenerated almost instantly, demonic essence knitting torn flesh back together. Angron's attacks grew more savage as frustration built. How dare his brother resist? How dare Sanguinius stand when he should fall? In a final desperate gambit, as Angron prepared what should have been a killing blow, Sanguinius lunged forward. He allowed Angron's black blade to pierce his armor, to drive deep into his side, accepting a potentially mortal wound to create an opening. As the World Eater's Primarch's weapon impaled him, Sanguinius reached up and grasped the butcher's nails embedded in Angron's skull, the cybernetic implants that had driven the Red Angel to madness, that had stolen his capacity for anything beyond rage. Sanguinius tore them out. The psychic backlash was catastrophic. Angron's head exploded, his demonic essence shrieking as it was forced back into the warp. The World Eater's forces, witnessing their Primarch's banishment, lost whatever thin veneer of sanity remained. They began attacking indiscriminately, cutting down their own allies in fits of berserker rage. The traitor assault broke, wavering for the first time since the siege began. But the victory came at terrible cost. Sanguinius collapsed, the wound Angron had inflicted bleeding freely despite his Primarch physiology. The last defenders retreated through the Eternity Gate as it finally sealed shut, the angel borne along by his sons. They had held. Against impossible odds, through sacrifices beyond counting, they had held the gate. The inner palace remained inviolate. The Sanctum Imperialis stood unbreached. Hours later, word reached the defenders that brought mixed emotions. Jagatai Khan and the White Scars, in a daring raid, had retaken the Lionsgate spaceport long enough to reactivate its orbital defense weapons. The massive cannons turned skyward, firing at the traitor fleet hanging in low orbit. Ships that had grown complacent, believing themselves safe from ground fire, died by the dozens. The flow of traitor reinforcements was cut in half at a single stroke. More importantly, the Dark Angels had arrived in force. Soon the Ultramarines would follow. Leman Russ and the Space Wolves were only days behind. The relief Dawn had bought time for with so much blood was finally at hand. The siege could be broken. The traitors crushed between the defenders and the relief force. Victory, impossible for so long, suddenly seemed within reach. Horus understood this as clearly as anyone. Aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the War Master faced the reality of his situation. He had gambled everything on breaking Terra before reinforcements arrived. That gamble had failed. The siege had lasted too long. The defenders had held too stubbornly. Now he faced the prospect of being trapped in the Sol system. His forces ground down between two armies while supply lines stretched to breaking. The Chaos Gods had promised him power. They had elevated him to something beyond Primarch, had granted him abilities that should have made victory inevitable. Yet here he stood, weeks into a siege that should have lasted days, facing defeat despite all his advantages. The gods whispered to him, offered him more power, demanded greater sacrifice. But Horus, in what might have been his last moment of true clarity, understood that more power would not change the fundamental situation. He needed to force a resolution immediately. The Emperor had to die now, this moment, before the Dark Angels could coordinate with the Defenders, before the Ultramarines arrived, before the Space Wolves added their strength to the relief force. There was only one way to accomplish this goal quickly enough: a direct assault, personal combat, Primarch against Creator. Horus gave the order that would determine the fate of the galaxy. He lowered the void shields of the Vengeful Spirit. The invitation was unmistakable. Come to me, teleport aboard my flagship. Let us end this war through single combat as it should have been decided from the beginning. Champion against champion, son against father. The future of humanity determined by one final duel. The Emperor, deep within the Sanctum Imperialis, sensed the shields lowering. He understood immediately what it meant. Horus was desperate. The War Master sought to force a conclusion through personal confrontation, rather than continuing the grinding siege. It was obviously a trap. The Vengeful Spirit had been corrupted into something that existed as much in the warp as in real space. Anyone who teleported aboard would face horrors beyond imagining, would be separated and isolated, picked off before they could unite. Yet the Emperor also recognized it as the only path to ending the siege quickly enough to save Terra. If he remained on the Golden Throne, the traitors would eventually breach through sheer attrition. But if he could kill Horus, the traitor coalition would collapse. The Chaos Gods might possess powerful servants, but Horus was the linchpin holding the rebellion together. Without the War Master, the traitor forces would dissolve into infighting and retreat. Malkador the Sigillite protested. The Emperor could not abandon the Golden Throne. If he left, the webway breach would collapse catastrophically, demon legions flooding directly into the Imperial Palace. Malkador's arguments were logical, well-reasoned, undeniable. The Emperor acknowledged their validity. Then he explained what must be done. Malkador would take his place upon the Golden Throne. The ancient Perpetual, the Emperor's oldest companion and most trusted advisor, understood what this meant. The Golden Throne had been designed for the Emperor's use. It required psychic power beyond anything Malkador possessed to operate properly. Sitting upon the throne would kill him, slowly, agonizingly, as it drained his essence to maintain the barriers. But there was no alternative. Someone had to hold the breach while the Emperor confronted Horus. Malkador ascended the throne without further argument. If his death could save Terra, he would die gladly. The Emperor gathered his forces for the assault. Rogel Dawn would accompany him, the Praetorians' presence necessary for what was to come. Sanguinius, wounded but determined, refused to be left behind. Constantine Valdor and elements of the Custodes would provide elite support. Several companies of Imperial Fists and Blood Angels Terminators would form the bulk of the assault force. Before they departed, the Emperor issued final orders. Vulcan would remain to guard the throne room and protect Malkador. Jagatai Khan would assume overall command of the palace defences. Whatever happened aboard the vengeful spirit, Terra must hold. The defenders must trust that reinforcements would arrive in time. Then, at the appointed moment, reality shimmered as teleportation fields activated. The Emperor, his Primarch sons and his elite warriors, translated from the Imperial Palace to the corrupted halls of Horus's flagship. The assault force materialized, expecting coordinated arrival. Instead, Horus had prepared a trap. He used his psychic connection to the vessel to scatter the teleporting forces throughout the massive ship. Each individual or small group appeared in different locations, isolated from their companions. The vengeful spirit had transformed during the heresy into something that defied categorization. Its interior spaces existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Corridors stretched for impossible distances. Rooms contained geometries that hurt the mind to perceive. The ship had become an extension of Horus's will, a realm where he held absolute dominion. Custodians fought through corridors that shifted and changed. Rogel Dawn organized his scattered forces, calculating the most efficient path toward the bridge. Sanguinius appeared closest to the War Master's throne room, moving through passages that whispered of corruption. Each step brought him closer to his destiny, to the brother he had once loved who now sought his death. Time became meaningless aboard the vengeful spirit. Minutes felt like hours. The ship existed partially in the warp where conventional time had no meaning. Those fighting through its corridors continued forward, because stopping meant death or worse. Horus waited in Lupercal's court. He had transformed beyond recognition, his body swollen with demonic might. He was no longer simply Horus Lupercal. He had become the chosen of chaos, the vessel through which the ruinous powers would claim reality itself. Sanguinius reached him first, as prophesied. The Blood Angels Primarch had known this moment would come. Every vision had shown him this confrontation. He would face Horus. He would die. But perhaps, in dying, he could wound the War Master enough to give the Emperor a chance. The War Master sat upon his throne, transformed into something barely recognizable. His armor had fused with his flesh. Demonic energy radiated from him in waves. He was no longer simply a Primarch. He had become the chosen of chaos, vessel for all four dark gods simultaneously. Horus offered Sanguinius a final chance to join him. The angel's refusal was absolute. The battle that followed was brief and brutal. Sanguinius fought with everything remaining, carving wounds that should have been fatal. But Horus regenerated almost instantly. The War Master's counterattack overwhelmed the exhausted angel. Horus's black blade impaled Sanguinius, driving through his chest. The noblest of the Primarchs, the Emperor's brightest son, was dead. The Emperor arrived to find his son's corpse displayed like a trophy. The Master of Mankind faced his fallen son knowing the full scope of what he confronted. This was Horus, elevated to serve as conduit for all four Chaos Gods simultaneously, their combined power flowing through him to destroy the Emperor and claim real space for the warp. The duel transcended simple physical combat. They fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously, their psychic powers clashing with force sufficient to tear reality apart. The Emperor wielded the Rune Sword. Horus countered with weapons blessed by dark gods. For a time, the Emperor held back, unable to use his full power against his favoured son. This hesitation proved nearly fatal. Horus felt no such restraint. His assault drove the Emperor back. His lightning claw opened the Emperor's throat. His psychic blast seared flesh from bone. The Emperor fell, broken, his body rent with mortal wounds. Horus lifted his father high, preparing to deliver the final blow that would end everything. The Emperor, pushed to oblivion's brink, faced a terrible choice. He could draw upon the warp itself, ascend to become a fifth Chaos God, the Dark King, powerful enough to destroy Horus and everything else. The Emperor began that transformation. Power flooded into him, dark and absolute. Then Olanius Person arrived. The ancient Perpetual, the Emperor's companion from ages past, saw his friend becoming a monster Ollanius reminded him of his humanity, begged him not to become what he fought against. The Emperor recognized his old friend. The sheer unlikelihood of this meeting shocked him back to awareness. He released the gathered power, accepting that he might not be able to defeat Horus. He gambled humanity's future on faith rather than certainty. The release swept across Terra and the vengeful spirit, banishing much of the warp madness. Horus recovered and saw Ollanius standing before the Emperor's unconscious form. The War Master found this amusing, a mortal thinking to defend against a demigod. Ollanius unloaded his laser gun into Horus's chest, shots sparking harmlessly off corrupted armor. With casual contempt, Horus reduced Ollanius' person to red mist. But Ollanius had given his friend the Athame blade before dying, pressing it into the Emperor's hand. He had bought precious moments for the Emperor to recover consciousness. The Emperor rose, Sanguinius dead, Ollanius annihilated. So many sacrifices. The Master of Mankind finally accepted what he must do. There would be no redemption for Horus. The War Master had to die completely. His soul burned away so the Chaos Gods could never resurrect him. The Emperor channeled his full power into the Athame blade and drove it through Horus's chest. The weapon served as conduit for psychic might beyond mortal comprehension. The Emperor's power burned through Horus's corrupted form, incinerating the demonic enhancements, everything Chaos had bestowed. Horus's armor melted, his flesh charred, his bones turned to ash. In his final moments, the Chaos God's hold broke. Horus saw clearly what he had become. He begged for forgiveness. The Emperor granted that mercy, obliterating Horus so completely that nothing remained but a skeleton inside charred armor. The War Master was dead. His soul was gone, burned away beyond resurrection. The Chaos Gods shrieked their fury and retreated. Without their champion, they could not maintain their presence. The corruption receded. With the deed done, the Emperor collapsed. The wounds Horus had inflicted were mortal even by his standards. When Rogel Dawn and Constantin Valdor reached the throne room, they found 3 bodies. Sanguinius, noble in death. Horus, reduced to ash. And the Emperor, barely clinging to life, his form broken and bleeding. The Emperor had only moments of consciousness remaining. Dawn was to take him to the Golden Throne. Malcador had held the barriers, but would die the moment the Emperor took his place. Terra had to be preserved, even if it meant the Emperor would spend eternity bound to a machine, unable to guide his Imperium directly ever again. Dawn carried his father from the vengeful spirit with tears streaming down his face. The Praetorian had never wept before, but he wept now for what they had won and lost. The defenders had held Terra. Word reached the traitor forces of Horus's death, and they broke, fleeing in disarray. The Dark Angels had arrived. The Ultramarines were days behind. Relief forces would pursue the fleeing traitors in what would become the Great Scouring, but victory tasted of ashes. Malcador died the moment the Master of Mankind took his place upon the Golden Throne, crumbling to dust as his essence was consumed. Sanguinius would never see the Imperium he had died to protect. The Imperium itself had been ravaged beyond repair, billions dead on countless worlds. The siege had lasted 55 days. In that time, Terra had been transformed from humanity's gleaming capital into a scarred wasteland. The defenders had held, but barely. The margin between victory and defeat had been measured in moments and individual choices. The age of the Imperium had begun, not with triumphant unification, but with the Master of Mankind entombed, half the Primarchs dead or corrupted, and humanity facing a future where survival would require constant vigilance. The light of the Astronomicon would continue to shine, guiding ships through the darkness, but it would be powered by the suffering of the Emperor upon his golden cage, a beacon fueled by pain and sustained by sacrifice. The price of victory was everything, and humanity would pay it for 10,000 years to come.